Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a keynote speaker, Wall Street Journal bestselling author, presidential secretarial and gubernatorial advisor, U.S. ambassador, UN delegate, corporate executive with leadership at the highest levels of business, government, and military sectors, board member, public speaker, commentator, public-private partnership expert, and so on. Lisa, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us. The stage is yours. I'll be responsible for the chat. If we have any questions, everyone, you can also raise your hands. And once we open for questions, of course, we'll go one by one and tackling your concerns. Lisa, again, thank you so much, and the stage is yours.
Great. So nice to meet all of you. I greatly appreciate your joining from all corners of the world, and I look forward to talking with you today. So you've already heard about who I am, but one of the things to know, and you probably can tell this, is there's not a lot that scares me. I have flown in helicopters over the DMZ on the Korean Peninsula. I've flown into war zones, leaving the airport in blackened out vehicles surrounded by guys with submachine guns. I've even survived being on television with Big Bird in Japan. But it's not always easy being a woman in what was always a man's world when I was starting my career. Early and often, I was very much the odd girl out. One of the things we talk a lot about today is the imposter syndrome. And this is a picture of me at the U.S. Army War College, where I was frequently in conversations at the War College or at the Pentagon talking about national security back in the 1980s and early 90s with men who'd seen combat. I'm 28 years old in this picture, and there wasn't a lot I could do about my size and stature. I'm still 5 foot tall. I still don't weigh very much. And so what I had to do is I had to learn about other ways of communicating. I had to learn to do my research in advance, do extensive advanced preparation. I would walk into meetings knowing the number one question that I wanted to ask, and I'd wait until there was a lull in the conversation, and then I would ask the question that needed to be asked. And that was the only way we could solve the underlying problem that we were in that room having a conversation about. So I mentioned this because today, in today's environment, especially young people like yourselves, we're all in a position where all of us are new to it. And one of the things as we look at people at Google and Facebook and big companies, large and small, maybe some of you are in entrepreneurial endeavors, maybe some of you are still at university, but the reality is the innovations are happening so quickly that what people don't realize is that it's actually new to everybody. And so it's always funny to me when I talk to people at Google and they say that something like 60% of the employees suffer from an imposter syndrome. And what I remind them is everything that's been created that they're working on, no one's ever worked on before. But there are certain fundamentals of a turnaround. There are certain fundamentals of transformation. And most importantly, they're basic elements of who we are as people that will always impact our ability to utilize communications technology in their best way possible, but that the world has actually not changed that much in the manner in which we people operate in over 2,000 years. What you need to do is in the United States, we have a term, which is called own the purple elephant in the room. And what that means is that, again, you want to come in having done a lot of research in advance, because research and data are your secret weapon when you're trying to make what matters to you matter to someone else. The world right now has not reset with COVID. I think there were a lot of people that had great expectations, business people, people in politics, people in government who thought, okay, COVID's been bad, but we're going to come out of it. We're going to run really, really fast, and we'll be able to be successful. But the reality is that the push and pull of adversity versus opportunity continues to exist. On one hand, we have rising costs. We have geopolitical conflict. We have fears about what's going on with China. We have fears about what's going on with Russia and the Ukraine. But on the opposite side, we have biotechnology that's coming into developing therapies to treat rare diseases. We have people developing space transportation. And we actually have Elon Musk talking about colonizing Mars. And so what I want to do is you are addressing the problems that you're facing in your country as you move into your career. I want to give you the tools that you need in order to know how to turn around bad situations, how to transform something. It may take a little longer because all the dynamics and the economics of the business are very, very complicated right now. The supply chain's not working too well. We're learning that perhaps we may have gone too far on some ESG, environmental sustainability, governance issues. And so we have to swing back to the center and we need to find our way out. And so the 4 steps, I wrote a book called Turn Around: How to Change Course When Things Are Going South. And there are 4 steps I describe in the book. In any situation, what you want to do is visualize the future. Stop thinking about the problem as it exists today and focus on where you want to end up. Step number 2 is break down the past. Figure out what still works and what's going to continue to work as you're moving towards that future model that you want. And then also get rid of those things that no longer work. Pretty straightforward. You're going to create a path from your present to your future. You now know what works and what doesn't. So you're going to map out critical decisions and actions that are needed to accomplish your objective. And finally, because you've done this good work and you've done it with research and data as your secret weapon, you're going to execute with speed, confidence, agility, and heart. You're going to set aggressive goals and you're going to work and foster effective partnerships. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through each of the steps, and I'm looking forward to the questions you might have about particular situations that you're facing. Step number 1, visualize the future. What I always tell people, it doesn't matter if I'm meeting with a very high-level elected official, the head of a government, and I have met with a number of prime ministers and princes and presidents before, or if I'm talking to a CEO, or perhaps I'm talking to someone that's at a junior point within an organization. And what I try to get them to focus on is, what should the future look like? What do you want the world to look like in 5 years, possibly in 10 years? But in 5 years, what is your perfect reality? If you could wave your magic wand and poof, we're in the future, what would that future look like? And by doing that, what you've done is you've thought about the fact that we're not there right now. If you were starting your organization from scratch today, if you were starting an entity that you want to see turned around today, how would you design it? That's really the question. What that does is it separates you from all the mess of what's going on and allows you to focus on what I call jobs 1, 2, and 3. When I worked at Intel Corporation, I worked for a man who was a very famous technologist in the United States and globally back in the late 80s and early 90s. His name was Andy Grove. And I would suggest that if you don't know who he is, that you Google him. But basically, Andy was someone who grew up in Hungary during the Soviet Empire. He escaped from Hungary in 1956. He came to the United States and he started Intel Corporation with 2 other people. And he was the president of the company. And under his watch, Intel went from $1 billion company to being the supplier of 85% of semiconductors in the world in the 90s. And the way Andy did this is he talked about job 1. If we can't do anything at all, every morning when we wake up, if there's only one thing we can do to survive, what is that number 1 thing? And what I talk about with jobs 2 and 3 is I call them the supporting cast. If you were putting on a play, those are the singers, those are the instrumentalists, they're the activities that are supporting your job number 1. And as you focus on job number 1, you're constantly looking for any enemies, any competition that could possibly help stop you from delivering on job number 1. And so you're reframing success. All of success is reframed around that number 1 thing. For Intel, for Andy, that number 1 thing was to be the number 1 semiconductor manufacturer in the world. And it's a position that Intel held for a very long time, obviously not today. And then what you're going to do is you're going to evangelize your vision. You're going to go out and tell people why in 5 years the world should look like you've described it, why you need to focus on job one. And most importantly, you need to help people understand where their place is in the future, because everyone has to benefit from what it is that you're rolling out. Vision's the critical ingredient to getting to the end state. When John F. Kennedy, who was president of the United States in the 1960s, was facing one of his greatest crises, what took him through it is having vision. And that crisis was this. The Soviet Union had just lost Sputnik. Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, had circled the Earth. And the United States was under dire threat that they would lose their position as the technological superpower in the Cold War. And what Kennedy knew is that he needed to regain the support of both the individual as well as the scientific community to materially understand why it was that all of them should be supportive of his vision. And because of his vision, the United States in 1969 was able to have the first man walk on the moon. And that actually accelerated into what would later become Silicon Valley and defense technologies and a great deal of research. But it all started with one man, John F. Kennedy, having a vision and getting people to buy into his vision in order to achieve an objective. Figuring out what went wrong in the past is one of the number one things that you can do. And what I mean by that, it doesn't matter if you're in a company, if you're in a government program, if you are a policy person advocating a particular position. What you want to do is you want to audit everything that has gone on before. And what I suggest to people is if you can't figure out what's going on, sometimes we see things at a surface level, and you've heard perhaps there's another American term that talks about you see the tip of the iceberg. And we all know when you see that picture, here's the tip of the iceberg, and then the bigger part of the iceberg is down beneath. In some cases, a program started based on an incorrect premise. That program may have been around for 20 years, and we see this quite often with government programs. But it also happens within companies. And so you want to go back and you want to audit everything that currently exists. And you actually want to go back in historical documents and find out why that thing was started. What was the position that it was taking? But most importantly, what problem was it trying to solve? And did it ever solve that problem? So was the creation of the turnaround need recent, or was it really based on what happened in the past, which is all the action taken didn't actually solve the problem why the entity started? And you're going to give your assets, your current assets, values. You're going to rank and rate things. You're going to decide what's most important, what's second least important. And you're going to go through a checklist because something always has to come out on top. And what you're going to do is you're going to decide what stays and what goes. And you're going to reassure everybody throughout the process. I call this evangelizing your vision. You're going to go to people along the way and you're going to be transparent with them. You're going to show them the audit. You're going to show them how you've ranked and rated things. You're going to ask them for their opinion. Do they agree with you? Is there something that they would put at a higher level? And you're going to have a back and forth conversation because change always impacts people. It always impacts people. It could impact the person who owns the program. It could impact people at the basic level in their homes. But no matter what happens, change does impact somebody. So you need to get those people on board with your vision. But most importantly, along those lines, you need to act with compassion and humility. You need to understand that when you're making those changes, someone will suffer. Now, in some cases in a company, what we always remind people is that change has to happen. Sometimes people have to be let go of their jobs. Sometimes a new market will replace an old market and someone will lose. There are always winners and losers, but you have to acknowledge that they are winners and losers. You have to be actually able to talk with them and acknowledge the pain that they're suffering at that given moment. And if you're really good, what you're going to do is find them something that they can do that's different. Maybe reskill them, teach them new skills, maybe provide them with a move where they can go to a different place and be more successful. But you need to always recognize that this is always about people, and it has been going back until Aristotle. What I tell people is you're winding up for your next pitch. It's a term in baseball. You're figuring out what went wrong in the past, and you're going to move forward very quickly, because otherwise you'll lose your credibility. And I tell another story, which is called the $10 tuna fish sandwich. And what that story is about, when I became the United States ambassador to the World Expo in Japan, what I did not know is that the Congress, the US government's entity that makes the decision about funding of government programs, had defunded the program. I also didn't know that the person who had had my job before me was investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he'd been indicted. I didn't know any of this until after I'd taken my job. And in fact, what happened is that I was at the US Department of State, and I was signing an agreement with Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State, and Dr. Shoshiro Toyota, who was the chair of Toyota Motor Corporation. He was also the co-chair of the World Expo in Japan. All was going great, and I was on my way to the airport because I was getting on an airplane to fly to Japan to sign the bilateral agreement in Japan at the United States Embassy there. And I get a phone call. And then during that phone call, people explained to me that my airfare wouldn't be covered and my trip to Japan wouldn't be covered, because they still hadn't figured out a legal way to do that because of the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the guy who went before me, who almost went to jail. So I get to Japan, and my husband and I ended up paying for the trip. I ended up paying for a trip that was a US government function. I was signing an agreement on behalf of the United States with a foreign country. And what I tell people is I ate a lot of $10 tuna fish sandwiches on the Ginza. I found these little tea shops where I could buy food at a very low rate, while other people were having fancy dinners and having expensive whiskey. And what I figured out is I went through and I started figuring out how I would gain my credibility, how we would get this thing paid for, how I would bring a group of people from the United States to figure out how they could create business deals around foreign direct investment and manufacturing. And the way I did that is through the steps we just talked about. As I went through lots of boxes, I went back and I understood what was problematic about funding for World's Fairs in the past. And I understood and I looked at how people spent their money in the past. And what I realized is that they would collect the money and they would spend it right away. And they would forget, as they were building this building to go to the expo, that when the expo opened, you still had cost. In fact, that's where the majority of your costs were. But what was happening is people were spending way too much money at the beginning, and they were forgetting to save money for the back end, for the event itself. And as a result of that, I ended up ranking and rating and getting rid of things, and actually ended up on budget using the process that I just described. And we were rated the top pavilion on 2 separate occasions during the time of the expo. Congress celebrated the victory. We were able to produce everything we were supposed to. And most importantly, I was able to bring jobs to Americans in the United States through deals that we made in the auto industry and travel and tourism and technology. Things go south because we are human. I spend a great deal of time studying Socrates and Aristotle, even the Bible. And I go back throughout history and I look at warfare, and it doesn't matter what form of community. Look at the Catholic Church versus the Protestant Church, and the Reformation versus the time periods where the churches were fighting. And what you come down to is throughout human history, technology will improve, innovation will improve, communications will improve, but people will always stay the same. And so what you'll discover is that there's the reason for a turnaround is that something was built poorly and was designed poorly. Some people think money can solve all problems. And so we see governments do it all the time. They throw a lot of money at something, but the problem is money can't solve the problem. Only good process can. The economics of the business will sometimes make it impossible to be successful. We're seeing that today. Despite how hard and good processes that businesses have, because there are disruptions in the supply chain, they're unable to meet the needs of their customer. I say they're stuck in a cookie cutter approach to management. People read a lot of business books. I hope you read mine. But there's processes that everybody's always used. And what they forget to do is do what I'm talking about, is going back and understanding fundamentally, why was that thing started in the first place? What did the legal paper say? What did the first communication say about why that thing was launched? And then people are just bad sometimes. They have more self-interest. They're more about empire building. They forget that they're supposed to be a steward of an institution. The institution isn't there to serve them. The government isn't there to serve the government official. The business isn't there to serve the chief executive. It's there to serve the customers, the taxpayers, the donors, the partners. Sometimes founders will overstay their welcome. We've seen many times in government and also in companies where somebody gets kicked out. They may have been very effective during the first 10 years of their time period. They should have left when they were at their highest point. They stuck around a little too long. It became too much about ego. And then sometimes things just need to be shut down. There's sometimes, you've started something for a good reason, but it no longer needs to exist. It no longer serves a purpose because the world has changed. And what you should always feel comfortable doing is shutting something down, celebrating the victories that it had, but then moving on and save the money. So we've gone through this process, and we're at what we call the decision tree process. You're creating a path. You've ranked and rated things. You've got rid of things. Now you need to move forward. And I love to use decision trees. If any of you have studied engineering, you know that there's trees that are visible that you build, and they allow you to make decisions. They make you go into yes and no choices. They give you a construct on a piece of paper for where you're ultimately trying to go and the path to get there. And then you have to focus on the team that you're building. You want smart people, credible people, people that use research and data, and people that share your vision and that operate like you do, that have the same moral values that you do, that have the same operational drive you do. They show up at work on time. They're committed to what you're doing. And then you're going to constantly refine things as you move forward. And finally, you're going to execute with speed, confidence, agility, and heart. You always want to set aggressive goals. Don't be timid. If you don't achieve your goal, then make a course correction, but keep your eye on, if you still ultimately believe that that goal is where you have to go. Sometimes we have to zig and zag. Sometimes we're climbing up a hill and all of a sudden we hit a rock and we fall down again, but you want your goals to be aggressive. And most importantly, you want to look for an opportunity to partner with other people. As I said, we're going to focus on job one. There's only one thing we can do really, really well as an institution. But guess what? Those other things that are required in order to move that product to market or to get that government program to the consumer is actually being produced by someone else. It's their job number one. And so what we forget is we can't be all things to all people. We can't do everything. So we want to streamline what we're doing, and we want to go out and find people that have different activities that align with our goals. They may be a supply chain partner. They might be a private sector partner to a public sector partner. There's always an opportunity to join forces, link arms with someone else, focus on a goal together. And it makes it far more cost effective because each of you are focused on the primary place where you're the best at doing it. Intel was the best back in the 1990s in making semiconductors. Our partners were IBM and Microsoft. They made software, IBM made hardware. Together, Intel salespeople went into the information technology offices at high technology companies, and they sold their products as a set. And that's how they beat Apple for a long period of time. So partnerships are good. In fact, partnerships are the only way in a tough economic environment for you to survive. And because you form those partnerships, because you've done your work, because you know what you need to do, you're going to be confident, but you're also going to be diplomatic because you're going to remember that as you're making these changes, it affects other people. I can't tell you how important it is to have diplomacy and discipline as part of your makeup. When things are blowing up, discipline is so critical to digging your way out. You need to examine your process very carefully. And again, you need to focus on what you need to get rid of. But if you think about any two things, just keep those two words in your mind as you're going through change: discipline, diplomacy. You need for people to want to work with you to get there to the end state. And most importantly, you want to remember that the path to the top, it's not a straight line. So you're going to take the opportunities around you. You're going to make the most of them. You're going to develop what I call a best of class personal professional team. And that's resources and projects and people that throughout your life, I'm in my late 50s, but you guys are young and you have come together in this group. These are your professional team. I can't begin to tell you how when you're my age, you're going to look back and go, yay, remember when we were on that seminar together? Remember when we were part of that event? You're going to help each other up the career ladder. But most importantly, you're going to leave a deliverable at every step you take because your impact on the world can be viewed from the changes that you were personally involved with. You're also going to help other people succeed because sometimes it's going to be your time to be on top. Sometimes it's going to be your friend's time to be on top, but you're going to keep working together. You're going to help other people be successful because a group of very successful people can move forward together. And a term I use is that life is not a competition, it is a collaboration. And finally, you're never going to give up, but you got to be willing to regroup. Sometimes it's just not going to work. Sometimes you have an idea, it's a great idea, but it's not the moment for that idea. There's a company was called General Magic. When I was living in Silicon Valley back in the 90s, two of the hottest companies were General Magic and CGI, which was Silicon Graphics Company. And they had great technologies. General Magic was one of the first ones to be using devices to do all the exciting things we do today. And CGI was making this incredible animation and programming that seems so normal today, but back then it was all new and they were doing things like Jurassic Park's first movie. Neither of those companies still exist today. They didn't have a sustainable process, but the ideas, the patents, the concepts made their way into what's now called the iPhone. They made their way into what we now call Zoom. And so you need to know that it may not work today. And there's a book I'm going to refer to you. It's written by Tony Fadell, Fadell. He is a friend of my husband's, and he created the iPhone. He created the iPod, and he actually started his career at General Magic. So the ideas don't go away, but the manifestation of the idea may not be right for that moment in time. And that's what Tony's book, it's called Build, is all about. And as you move up that ladder, remember to be kind and mentor other people. You can always mentor someone else. You can mentor someone who's younger than you are, or you can actually be a mentor to someone older. I actually have a team of mentors for my book and for marketing who are all in their 20s because you understand technology that I don't understand. I had a lot of questions about Zoom when we started this. I wasn't loading it properly. People know how to use Instagram. They know how to use TikTok. And so you can actually mentor someone like me. And you always have to be open to being mentored by someone else because it's how you treat people that's going to define who you are as a leader. That's how people are going to remember you. That's how you're going to build your legacy. Because you're going to leave a mark on the world. You're going to make what matters to you matter to others. And by leaving your mark on the world is all the successes that you build up by partnering with other people. Those things that you left behind, maybe they're not going to make the history books, but they may be the foundational pieces for things that do make the history books. So to recap, how to lead a successful turnaround, you're going to start your process that I described without assumptions. You're going to take the time to engage in what I call shuttle diplomacy, going around and talking to everybody impacted. You're going to find people like yourself, like-minded people who are going to help you execute your vision. You're not going to treat every battle, every step in the process like a battle. You're not going to be fighting with people. It's not worth it, trust me. You're going to keep the commitments that you make to other people. And most importantly, as we close, you're going to learn to be a lifelong learner. And what I mean by that, and this is a great quote, in times of change, it's the learners who inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. None of us know the answers. The technology is moving very, very quickly. The world is changing rapidly, and geopolitical realignments are happening as we are talking today. We don't know what's going to happen, but we're going to pivot, we're going to learn, we're going to partner with other people. And together, I have great faith that everybody who's on this webinar is going to be highly successful because you're starting with the right principles that I believe are necessary in order for you to change the world.